Have you ever wondered how 5,000 people live, work, and breathe on a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier, while a single misstep could trigger an international catastrophe? In this video, you will see how a massive aircraft carrier faces a daring provocation, with the line between peace and war hanging by a thread. I stood by the panoramic window of the aircraft carrier's combat center, staring at the water's surface, which seemed deceptively calm, as if the sea itself were warning me, everything you see is only the surface. Beneath my feet, the massive steel plates vibrated as dozens of people walked across them, each absorbed in their instruments, reports, and radio communications, yet fully aware that a single misstep could turn this day into a story that would be talked about for years. On the radar screens, small but clearly distinct blips slowly appeared. Several ships from the coastal nation, seemingly deliberately choosing dangerously close trajectories, as if testing our endurance and readiness for the unexpected. I felt a chill run down my spine that no air conditioner could have caused. It was an instinctive understanding that these maneuvers were no accident, but a carefully calculated show of force, challenging a giant accustomed to unquestioned control over the seas. The radio, usually monotone and calm, suddenly filled with short, sharply pronounced alerts that overlapped, creating a hum reminiscent of the low roar of an approaching storm. Track contacts. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Check combat systems, all sounded at once, each tone feeling like both a curse and a salvation. I watched as young officers clenched their fists and held their breath for a moment, while the senior officers, who had seen far more situations like this, tried to maintain composure, though a shadow of concern flickered in their eyes. At the far end of the combat center stood the commanding officer, outwardly calm, but tense to the limit. I saw his fingers tapping silently on the edge of the table, as if trying to release a tension that could not be expressed in words. In his eyes was reflected a map of the strait, where every square kilometer represented dozens of decisions that would have to be made instantly if events spiraled out of control. I understood that on this carrier, in this strait, at this very moment, we were all dependent on each other like parts of a single intricate mechanism, where the failure of a single cog could result in catastrophe. When new signals appeared on the screens, two small but fast boats sharply changing course and heading toward us at an angle too precise to be accidental, something inside me flinched. My heart raced, my breathing became more pronounced, and my fingers instinctively moved to check the collision warning systems. Everything was as we had been trained, but reality never fully obeys instructions. Every maneuver, every movement, every fraction of a second delay could change the outcome, and we all knew it. I remembered the words of my mentor who once said, "The sea does not forgive weakness. Even the largest ship is merely a toy in the hands of the elements and the will of those who dare to take risks." And now, watching these small but determined ships, I felt that everything we had been taught was being put to the test. The line between respect and fear, between strength and vulnerability, had become so thin it seemed it could be torn apart by a glance. A new report came over the radio. One of the boats had passed at a critically close distance to the starboard side, leaving an almost invisible trail on the water. I felt a shiver run through the steel deck beneath my feet, and at the same moment, a strange silence settled over the combat center, as everyone realized that the next move could be decisive. We had spent the whole day observing, analyzing, and preparing, but this moment, when the maneuver of a neighboring nation approached a line that could not be crossed, was the true test. The ability to stay calm, calculate precisely, and maintain composure in our hearts. And when I looked again at the strait, its reflection in my eyes seemed more than just water. It was a mirror of our vulnerability, a place where any mistake could be too costly, and any decision could alter the fate not only of the crew, but of an entire nation. In that moment, I realized that everything leading up to this day had been merely preparation for the real trial, which was only beginning. And we all stood at the edge, watching as long shadows approached from the other side, ready to test what we were truly capable of. With each passing moment, the tension mounted, as if the very air around the aircraft carrier had grown denser, and the steel structures beneath our feet vibrated with a strange, almost tangible strain, as though the ship itself sensed the approaching danger alongside us. New blips appeared on the radar screens. Two additional fast, maneuverable boats moving so close that it felt as if they might graze the hull at any second, and any miscalculation could turn catastrophic. I felt adrenaline surge through my body, my breathing quickened slightly, and my fingers instinctively moved to the panels to check the collision warning systems, while my heart, as if anticipating everything that could happen, beat faster than usual. The commander at the central post remained outwardly calm, but I could see his gaze sweeping across maps, screens, and officer reports, evaluating distances, speeds, and trajectories, everything that could influence the split-second decision we might have to make. Inside the combat center, everyone was on edge. Some performed calculations, others held their breath, and a few silently repeated procedures to themselves like a mantra, trying to stave off panic. Every sound, the heartbeat-like thrum, the grinding of machinery, the crackle of radio transmissions, seemed to become part of a single tense orchestra where each note could foreshadow the outcome. I watched the flight deck, where pilots prepared for immediate takeoff, sitting tensely in their cockpits, eyes fixed on the point where sky met horizon. Their hands gripped the controls as if trying to seize a moment that was about to vanish. Every maneuver, every command here was a test of endurance, experience, and instinct, because a single lost instant could prove fatal. And it was clear to me that these young men, standing beside me, understood the same. This trial walked the razor's edge of human psychology, where fear and duty intertwined into a knot that could not be undone. Watching the approaching boats, I felt a surge of anxiety flare within me, like powder about to ignite. They shifted course, sharply adjusted their speed, maneuvering at critical distance, each move seeming to challenge us, a test of our resolve, precision, and ability to maintain control over the situation. I saw the commander give a signal, and part of the ship began cautious, evasive maneuvers, simultaneously preparing for any development that could occur in an instant, without warning. I recalled my mentor's words, "The sea does not forgive weakness." Now those words sounded like a warning, a quiet but unmistakable signal that everything we did was being tested in real time, and that any misstep could be costly. Inside me, everything seemed tense to the limit, breath, thoughts, and bodily sensations, all focused on a single goal, anticipating the enemy's movement and avoiding any error. Seconds stretched endlessly as one of the boats sharply changed course, moving almost parallel to the carrier's hull, leaving a barely visible wake that seemed simultaneously a warning and a challenge. I felt a shiver run along the entire structure, then through myself, as if all this massive spiel and machinery shared our tension. Inside the combat center, a heavy silence fell. Every gaze was fixed on screens, maps, and the horizon line where tiny shadows on the water seemed far larger than they really were. And in that moment, it became clear. The decisive maneuver was about to come. We had spent the day observing, preparing, and analyzing, but this very episode, these fast, audacious boats approaching almost dangerously close, testing us on the boundary between respect and fear, was the true test of endurance, professionalism, and the ability to make split-second decisions. And I knew that standing here, evaluating trajectories and reacting to every move of the opponent, the entire crew, the aircraft carrier, and the whole strait depended on a single moment in which none of us had the right to make a mistake. I stood at the center of the combat post, unable to take my eyes off the radar screens and maps, where every blip, every movement seemed alive and dangerous, as if the sea itself had decided to play a game with us, testing whether we had the endurance and precision to navigate through the trap laid by another's resolve and audacity. Enemy ships were closing in, leaving barely perceptible ripples on the water that shimmered on the indicators, and I felt the tension growing inside me, seeping into every I stood at the center of the combat post, unable to take my eyes off the radar screens and maps, where every blip, Every movement seemed alive and dangerous, as if the sea itself had decided to play a game with us, testing whether we had the endurance and precision to navigate through the trap laid by another's resolve and audacity. Enemy ships were closing in, leaving barely perceptible ripples on the water that shimmered on the indicators, and I felt the tension growing inside me, seeping into every muscle and nerve, as if we had become part of this complex, fragile mechanism where any misstep meant instant failure. On the deck, pilots sat in their cockpits, eyes locked on the horizon, hands gripping the controls, their breathing almost merging with the rhythm of sirens and the engine's hum echoing through the metal walls of the ship. I could hear every step of the crew, every brief report, every quiet "ready," creating the sensation of a single organism that breathed, felt, and reacted to the threat. The commander stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the screens, yet I could see the tension beneath his calm exterior, the restraint that demanded not only control over fear, but also over the impulse to act too quickly. An impulse that could undo everything we had built for hours, days, even years. His fingers tapped almost imperceptibly on the table, and each tap seemed to reverberate through my chest, as if the ship's inner rhythm synchronized with ours, setting the pace for decisions that had to be precise to the fraction of a second. In the air, time seemed both stretched and compressed. Each second dragged endlessly, yet slipped away too quickly to fully grasp the consequences of every action. I saw one of the enemy boats make a sharp maneuver, nearly threatening our hull, and my body tensed, my breath caught, and my fingers instinctively reached for the buttons to check all evasion systems, collision warnings, and communications, even though I knew the best weapon in this situation was calm and calculated judgment, not panic. Deck cameras showed the pilots preparing for immediate takeoff. Every movement was precise, every decision dictated by experience and instinct, because here there was no margin for error. Every detail, the speed of the boat, the angle of the wind, the distance to the hull could alter the outcome, and each of us felt as though we were balancing on a knife's edge, where the line between safety and disaster was so thin that a single wrong move could tear it apart. The radio filled with overlapping commands, short messages and reports that merged into a hum reminiscent of the low roar of the sea, and I felt my entire body tense, ready for immediate reaction. Seconds stretched into eternity as one of the boats sharply approached the starboard side, leaving a barely visible wake on the water that seemed simultaneously a challenge and a warning. I watched the crew respond in unison, every movement calculated, every command precise, and I realized that we had reached the moment where everything hinged on a single maneuver, and whether this day would end in disaster or a release of tension depended entirely on us. The commander gave a signal, slow, precise, yet resolute, and the entire team initiated a coordinated maneuver, a smooth, graceful, yet perfectly accurate course adjustment that allowed us to break the critical distance and regain control of the situation. My heart pounded, my breathing steadied, yet the internal tension remained. I understood that we had survived only because we functioned as a single organism, where every cog, every person, and every mechanism had performed its role flawlessly. When the enemy boats finally began to move to a safe distance, a strange silence settled over the combat center. No one applauded, no one smiled, yet everyone understood that we had crossed a boundary not everyone could withstand, and that the line between fear, respect, and power had never felt so thin and palpable. I looked out at the strait, where the water now reflected the calm sky, and realized that this day would remain etched in each of our memories as the moment when the world hung by a thread, and the only thing that saved us was endurance, discipline, and a single instant in which every detail mattered.
As the enemy ships slowly moved to a safe distance, a strange, almost tangible silence settled over the combat center. A silence that did not feel like relief, but like a quiet acknowledgement that we had barely crossed a boundary where anything could have happened. I stood by the panoramic window, gazing at the water, where the waves left by our massive hulls and the swift boats gradually spread and dissipated. leaving behind a faint, almost imperceptible wake, like a mark in memory that cannot be erased, a reminder that every moment here mattered and that every decision could be decisive. Inside me, I could still feel the ship's vibration, its steel, metal, and mechanisms, as if we had weathered a storm together, though the storm was not natural but human, a clash of will, calculation, and courage. The pilots returned to the deck, removing their helmets and checking their instruments, but no one allowed themselves joy or relief. Everyone understood that survival was possible only because each person had performed perfectly, restrained themselves from impulsive actions, and every cog in this massive organism that was the aircraft carrier had functioned flawlessly. I watched them and thought about how fragile the balance is between strength and fear, between respect and threat, between discipline and chaos, how one wrong move could have led to disaster, and now how we stood on a boundary where the sense of triumph and the awareness of risk merged into a strange, almost palpable feeling. The commander gave a brief report over the internal communication system, his voice calm and even, yet everyone who heard it understood that beneath that calm lay a deep awareness of how close we had come to the edge. Every maneuver, every command, every officer's glance had been critical, and all the experience accumulated over years had manifested here, on this day, in this strait. I felt both pride and exhaustion. Pride in the crew, in myself for enduring the trial, and exhaustion from realizing how much energy, focus, and internal tension had been poured into a few hours that had seemed to stretch into eternity. I looked at the wakes of the boats, at the faint mist rising over the water, at the shimmering reflections of the sun, and understood that the world that had seemed familiar and safe until today was fragile, almost illusory, and that the line between control and chaos runs where we cannot even see it, until we are at the edge. I remembered how, that morning, as we entered the strait, every movement and every report had seemed routine. And now, with everything concluded, it was clear that no routine could prepare one for the feeling of complete control while simultaneously being utterly dependent on circumstances. Inside the combat center, the usual post-storm silence settled in. No one hurried to speak. Each person understood that words were unnecessary because what had already happened, and would live in the memory of everyone. I looked again at the water, at the lines left by the ships, and realized that this wake was more than just physical. It was symbolic. The mark of our resolve, the imprint of our professionalism, and the trace of that fragile boundary upon which the peace between nations rests. And though the surface of the sea appeared calm once more, I could feel that this calm was deceptive, that beneath it lay untamed energy we had barely managed to restrain, and that the memory of this day would stay with me forever, reminding me that survival sometimes depends not on strength, but on endurance, precision, and the single moment that decides everything. When I finally turned away from the window and looked at the command crew, I saw tired but composed faces, aware that we had passed a trial capable of destroying everything. And at that moment, it became clear. The sea had returned to its usual calm, but the memory of how thin the line between peace and chaos is would remain with us. Like an invisible wake on the water that never disappears. A reminder that true strength is the ability to maintain control when everything around you seems ready to explode.